I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on the Spotlight Network, we uncover an unforgettable journey of tragedy, resilience, and faith with Dr. Stacy Ingraham. Her book is a powerful book, a poignant book. It is called The Untold Toll of a Wrongful Conviction, Resolve versus Closure. It takes readers through a harrowing true story of coercion, injustice, and God's redemptive power. The doctor's remarkable account is not just a story of survival, but a testimony to overcoming life's darkest moments through faith and determination. We're delighted to have this wonderful author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her amazing book. The links are below this interview. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me here today on Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm going to set this up because it's such an unbelievable story. You're a child, about 9 years old. The unthinkable happens. Your mother is murdered. Then it's compounded by the unthinkable again. Your father is accused. And then it's compounded once more with the unthinkable. You are coerced to testify against him. It's just absolutely despicable what happened to you in the early part of your life. Bring us back to that time. Tell us a little bit of what happened to your mother, why your father was accused, and why you were coerced to testify against him.
You know, part of the story is I was the only eyewitness the night of my mom's murder. Because as soon as I heard her screaming in the middle of the night, I jumped out of my bed. My instincts, my natural instincts, are to run to trouble, and that was my response. And as soon as I got to the doorway and saw my mom being chased and beaten, my sister in my bedroom called me back to our room. And you know, that is really one of those nights where you cannot explain to people what it means when you want to scream and you can't scream. The fright is unimaginable. You know, unfortunately, I saw some of the disturbance. My mom was hacked to death with an axe. And my first glimpse of the gentleman in our house, if you want to call him that, wasn't somebody I knew. And, you know, the night passed, you know, before all of that, while she was being beat to death, you just heard her screams condensed down to a whimper, to nothing. And I compare it to, you know, my husband is so wonderful. Like if you hear a rabbit being killed in the night by a coyote, it's the same sound. It's a screaming to nothing. And it's still painful for me to hear that sound because I'll never forget it. You know, the next thing I know is my dad is in our bedroom with two police officers. And I jumped out of bed and immediately ran to my dad and said, "Has that man left?" Got two police officers in the room, my dad in the room, and those are the first words out of my mouth. And those statements were also collaborated with my sister in the room. "Has that man left?" So the story unfolds then when you have my dad, who unfortunately was having an affair. At the time, he was running two restaurants and, you know, wasn't home a lot. You know, a mom of six kids, four young ones at home, and life was starting to get out of control. But, you know, 2 weeks prior to this, we were having phone calls that were threatening to our house. We ended up having our phone number unlisted. The first statement out of my mom's mouth when the doorbell rang was, "Why didn't you call?" Meaning she recognized him. But obviously, this person didn't have our phone number. So anyway, you know, the perpetrator basically told my mom my dad was in a car accident. And so the next thing you know, he's in our house and then he's beating my mom to death. Fast forward, you take us four kids to my brother's in-laws, and virtually there we were, it's a rough word, we were pawned off to an aunt and uncle who, you know, by God's grace, they opened their home to us. But even that wasn't a great situation. But back in the day, you know, people didn't really vet things. And I went through a lot of questioning. There was a police sketch that was made of the man I described. My story stayed true. We moved to Iowa. The murder happened right before Christmas. We were in Iowa to start school second semester. And literally when we got out to Iowa, it was like nothing had happened. Like my dad didn't come with us. He flew with us. But then we were there and we thought it was going to be temporary. Um, but really from that moment on, it was like my mom never existed. There were never conversations. And eventually the detectives were kind of coming with no alternatives. And they came out to Iowa to question me in a hotel room for over 6 hours with my aunt in that room. And they basically used the language of, do you love your dad? I'm like, yeah, I love my dad. My dad and I were close. I love my mom as well. Yeah. And, then it just went to, well, did you know your dad's going to marry another woman? Well, to now a 10-year-old, what does that really mean? My mom is dead. Right. I do understand that. And so then that didn't, get me to chime in any information. And so my story kept staying the same. And finally they said, did you know your dad is a sick man? And I said, no. And, in my mind, that's like strep throat. I don't know what that means. And they said, well, we can get help for him. Do you want us to get help for him? And I said, yes. All you have to do is tell us that he killed your mom. And my aunt was sitting in the room. And, they had questioned me for probably 5 hours up to that point, a 10-year-old in a hotel room with an aunt who she wasn't close to, 2 detectives she doesn't know. And they went out briefly and then came back in. And that's when their tone changed about their questioning to asking about, did I love my dad? Because my story didn't waver. My story has stayed with me. God has given me the memory to remember exactly what happened that night without any interruption into my memory. I mean, you can't forget it. You can't unsee it. And so bottom line is they went out, they left. They told my aunt never to talk about it, never to talk to me about it. And so again, I was basically silenced with no consultation, no counseling, nothing. And no love in a home where I felt like I could just talk. And so my dad was then arrested and tried. They had the death penalty on the table. I was guarded heavily by cops. No one was allowed to talk to me. The only time I was in a room was with my aunt and my sister Vic. And, the trial was one of the biggest scams. I mean, my testimony is in the book, and you just look at how many times the judge recessed. It was a political year. Somebody needed to be elected. It was one of the most heinous murders in the state of Virginia at the time. And they had the death penalty on the table. And of course, I'm not aware of any of this because I'm told not to look at my dad, not to talk to anybody. And, I'm just living in my own world. And I remember several times during the trial getting caught up in my own lies, and I didn't know what to do. And so, the judge would recess every time when that happened. And so I spent more time on the being questioned than anybody in the entire trial. The trial was over a week long, and my dad was sentenced. And again, this doesn't really make sense if you think about the murder. My mom was hacked to death with an axe. My dad was sentenced to second-degree murder. Doesn't even fit the crime. So, these are the parts of the story you just go, if you go through all the newspaper articles and all the court documents and all my dad's files, it doesn't even take a reasonable person to say this is a mess. But I was basically hushed until my dad was paroled on good behavior. He was actually, he was in the Richmond Penitentiary, which historically was one of the worst in the United States. And he was made available to work on their farm, which was kind of like the white collar job for a prisoner, because of who he was, how he carried himself. Nobody believed that he was a convicted murderer. And so he was paroled after 7 years. And then he hired a detective or an attorney to come out and re-question me. And I was a junior in high school. And it was the biggest day of relief for me. For the first time I could unload about the lie, which, I have to carry that lie for the rest of my life. I mean, yes, I'm forgiven in God's eyes. And yes, people understand, but it doesn't change what happened. My single testimony put my dad in prison, and not one person's been held accountable. And so my story really revolves around that. And it goes into how many times God put in my path the right people and how he allowed me to choose with free will the right things to do to carry myself throughout life. And, whether I'm hardwired to be a survivor, I am a survivor. Um, but even just 3 years ago, when I went out to get the police sketch from my dad's file, I showed up to the Petersburg Police Department and they knew I was coming. And then last thing I know, at 4 p.m. that day when they're closing, they said, the file hasn't existed since your dad was paroled. Meaning my dad's murder file is gone. There's no DNA evidence, nothing left from a murder, which just shows you the corruption. And the police chief at that time told me the whole department was known for corruption at that time. And I don't know this, but once I got to college and kind of got out of the household I was raised in, and again, kudos to them for taking us in, but it wasn't a good situation. There are a lot of victims from that, but at the end of the day, we've all kind of come out on our own end, and that's by the grace of God. Absolutely by the grace of God. And so I came to know Christ in college, which was incredible, changed my life forever. And so my whole point about resolve versus closure, we look for closure like a Disney ending. Like most stories don't have closure. It's just you have to have resolve with what's happened and then move with it. And, I'm a competitor, so you compete until the end. And this book became so important for me to write. So if I died tomorrow, my story has been told. My dad's story has been told. And all the facts are there. I did a lot of research for this book to make sure everything was spot on accurate. There's nothing that is like a feeling or it's point blank of all the things. And, the traversity of it is, my family, there's all kinds of issues with my sisters. And I'm not saying that in a bad way, but each one has had to deal with this in a way that, had we had counseling or the follow-up or just the right outcome, we would all have lived a little differently. So that's my passion.
It's unbelievable. It's a generational thing too. I don't think people turn to counselors and to psychologists and to psychiatrists like they do today. Obviously you needed a grief counselor at the very least at the loss of your mother, and everything kept on getting compounded, as I mentioned in the beginning, because it's compounded by the arrest of your father. It's compounded by the fact that they forced you to lie. And it's victimization upon victimization. How old were you when your father was finally paroled from prison?
So I was, must have been 17. A lifetime, right? Yeah. And he was never allowed to communicate with us, or as far as I know, whatever communication he did with us, it was niched. Like I said, for my aunt and uncle, it's like my mom and dad never existed. Like we were instructed to call them mom and dad from the get-go. And I just was never comfortable with that because it was just like your mom and dad never existed. You now have a new mom. And that's not true.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's awful too. And unfair. And I know you have to have gone through this with a counselor or something. You were just a child. You're responsible for nothing that happened to you that day. It was the most unbearable, horrible thing that could possibly happen in a child's life. And it was just made worse by the adults that surrounded you. Do you have any suspicions as to who your mother's killer was?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And he's named in the book. He was a neighbor. He was jealous of my dad's ranking in the military. He tried to he was infatuated with my mom and she declined. And I think he just took out his anger, and he was protected by the military. He was questioned several times, moved out of the state. He was actually a friend of our family, even though I didn't really know him, not to recognize him, and moved out of the state. My dad is left-handed. That's new evidence. I'm left-handed. Nobody asked. The murderer, clearly by the autopsy, was right-handed. There's just too many things. And so he died. The guy who killed my mom died younger than what would be expected. And yes, he lived a free life, but it's one of those, if he could look at himself every day in the mirror, because what I saw, the brutality of him killing my mom, I'm sure it's tenfold was in his life. And I don't know how you live with that.
Well, how do you do it in the first place? You're obviously a monster, right?
Right.
So yeah, I guess monsters do learn to live with those things, but it's horrible. Um, I assume you wrote the book because you want to clear your father's name. You want a
Yes.
record as to what really happened. And so
Yes.
this is you basically setting the record straight. And then, which I think is very, very kind of you, is you want to offer a beacon of hope to others who've gone through similar grievous situations that no matter how awful it is, and this is literally the most awful thing I can ever imagine happening to a person, what happened to you. If you can get through that, you can get through anything, right?
Y- I would like to believe that. And
Yeah.
again, that's where my faith comes in, because if you read through the book and you look at the families that adopted me, who paid for grad school, all the things, other misfortunes of, me getting hit by a car during my collegiate career and ending it, and then having a doctor who I became a part of their family. I mean, it's one thing after another that if you look for a good in the world, it is absolutely there. It is a choice. And writing the book just revealed to me how blessed I've been throughout my life. Um, yes, in a perfect world, I could have cleared my dad before he died, and I didn't get it done. This book was kind of my gift to him, but I also did all the legal homework. So if an attorney was to pick this up and get this righted, I'm not about punitive damages. I'm not. They need to right a wrong.
Need to set the record straight. So maybe somebody from the Southern Poverty Law Center or a lawyer working pro bono or a police detective could reopen this case, look at it, look at the evidence you've compiled in this book. It won't have any impact on your father, but it'll have an impact on his name. And of course, it'll have an impact on you because you know you helped set the record straight. The name of the book is The Untold Toll of a Wrongful Conviction, Resolve versus Closure. It takes readers through a harrowing true story of coercion, injustice, and God's redemptive power. Dr. Ingram's remarkable account is not just a story of survival, but a testimony to overcoming life's darkest moments through faith and determination. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us here today and sharing your story with us.
Thanks so much for taking the time.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate your candor and your generosity in sharing this story, which is ultimately a story of hope. To
Yes.
the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.